ATF rules about as much as I enjoy doing videos about force reset triggers.
Is that the weaponization of government when you have these agencies unilaterally change the law?
Growing threats against law enforcement. This morning, an FBI and Department of Homeland Security bulletin warns of increasing threats.
The threat bulletin was in fact the specificity of some of the calls to violence they were seeing online.
The ATF decided to change the definition of what an FFL, what a licensee was.
Congressional scrutiny of federal law. Dennis Lormel, a former FBI agent, has been closely monitoring the FBI and its members, including House hearings on the weaponization of the federal government. Lawmakers have criticized several federal law enforcement agencies, with some even calling to defund or disband them. The heated rhetoric risks burying threads of truth of government overreach that may merit legitimate questioning, which is troubling for their members. Lormel is an advocate for hearings if they are objective, but does not view these to be objective at all. The House Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, chaired by Republican Jim Jordan, has tasked itself with investigating the alleged politicization of the FBI's leadership and other federal law enforcement agencies. House Republicans issued a 1,000-page report in November based on whistleblower accounts describing the Washington hierarchy as rotted at its core and maintaining a systemic culture of unaccountability. The panel has also taken up constitutional questions of content moderation on social media, which they say censors conservative voices. At the first hearing, Rep. Jordan listed several agencies that he said ought to be examined, such as the Department of Justice, the Disinformation Governance Board, the ATF, and the IRS. The subcommittee has held several hearings thus far, with another set for Thursday. It is yet unclear what its findings will be or what long-term impact it will have on the agencies it is investigating. Despite several Republican lawmakers saying they are not aiming critiques at the agency's rank-and-file employees, federal law enforcement officers and Democrats have said nonetheless they are concerned about how this messaging will affect public trust, the agency's abilities to recruit, and workforce morale. In 2016, a total of 1,447 federal law enforcement officers were assaulted. In 2019, the latest year for which data is available, that number was 2,136, with about half of them being on patrol or guard duty when they were attacked. Massachusetts Rep. Stephen Lynch, a Democrat, expressed regret at the first hearing that the committee is based on the premise that the American people are under attack by the federal government, the Justice Department, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security. The special committee is tasked with investigating how federal agencies facilitate action against American citizens, including how the executive branch collects and shares information, the laws and programs authorizing it to do so, and any other issues related to the violation of civil liberties of citizens. Republicans have said they are aiming their criticism at the agencies as political bodies or at the top of their leadership, not the men and women working for them or agents in the field. Laszlo Simonyi, a former ATF employee of more than 20 years, now serves as vice president of the ATF Association Foundation, which advocates for agency workers and retirees. The attacks on federal law enforcement agencies trickle down to the individual agent and seep into public perceptions of officers who have to work harder to prove themselves. The ATF often is equated with being anti-Second Amendment, but it holds people accountable who violate federal arms laws and ensures that law-abiding citizens and their rights to own an arm are protected. While any agency can issue its own regulations with the full force of law, they must still be within rules already enacted by Congress. No source disputed the importance of rigorous oversight and investigation of federal agencies, stating it must be done in good faith. Watchdogs have uncovered instances of poor law enforcement work by federal agents, including weak controls over certain ATF-seized munitions and numerous ongoing investigations into whether the Federal Bureau of Prisons personnel use their authority with integrity. Truth behind ATF's new rule. The House Judiciary Committee's Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government is currently engaged in a critical hearing centered on the ATF. At the heart of the debate is the ATF's newly finalized rule, which clarifies that individuals engaging in commercial sales of arms must obtain dealer licenses and conduct background checks on buyers. This rule, a product of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, has sparked heated controversy, with claims from some quarters that it constitutes a naked power grab. However, a closer examination of the facts reveals a different story altogether. For years, there has been a notable loophole in federal law that allowed certain arms sellers to avoid obtaining dealer licenses and thus bypass the requirement to conduct background checks on prospective buyers. The BSCA, supported by a bipartisan coalition including 14 House Republicans and 15 Republican senators, aimed to address this issue. It clarified and tightened the definition of who is considered engaged in the business of dealing in arms, which triggers the requirement to obtain a federal firearms license and conduct background checks. Prior to the BSCA, the criteria for determining who needed an FFL were ambiguous, leading to widespread confusion and inconsistent enforcement.
New ATF rules about as much as I enjoy doing videos about force reset triggers, Partisan Safer Communities Act. A person was engaged in the business of being a firearms dealer. Now, I got news for you, ATF. Usually dropping 466 pages of rulemaking order does a lot of different things. According to ATF's own rulemaking order, the rule does the following. I believe you are engaged in this activity as a criminal, and of course if you're doing it without the license, of course then you are engaged in criminal activity.
The lack of clarity created a situation where individuals engaging in significant arms sale could avoid federal oversight and the responsibility of ensuring that arms were not sold to prohibited persons. To implement the BSCA's changes, the ATF finalized a rule that updated existing regulations to align with the new congressional standard of engaged in the business. It's crucial to note that neither the BSCA nor the ATF rule fundamentally alters the ability of law-abiding arm owners to sell arms. Instead, it clarifies which activities constitute engaging in the business of arms dealing and thus require a dealer license and background checks. The assertion that this rule is a naked power grab is inaccurate and misleading. The rule does not prevent law-abiding citizens from selling arms or conducting private sales. It simply aims to ensure that those engaged in the business of selling arms on a commercial basis adhere to the same standards and regulations that licensed dealers have followed for decades. This is not a new requirement, it is a clarification and reinforcement of existing law. Taking aim at Biden. Rep. Jim Jordan, the chair of the Selective Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, has been accused of colluded with federal agencies to attack conservative causes and former President Donald Trump. The committee will serve as a bully pulpit to lash out at the sitting president while driving investigations into his family. Jordan claimed during the committee's inception that it would follow in the footsteps of Senator Frank Church, who used his perch on the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities to investigate illegal spying on U.S. civilians by the National Security Agency and widespread CIA overreach, culminating in domestic propaganda campaigns. Thursday's hearing suggested that any effort to fundamentally reform out-of-control law enforcement and surveillance agencies would come second to both parties' attempts to use the committee for political ends. Jordan has taken every opportunity to rail against the perceived injustices of the deep state and curry favor with former President Donald Trump.
Is that the weaponization of government? When you have these agencies unilaterally change the law, definition of what a pistol brace and how that worked, and overnight made law-abiding citizens then. The ATF decided to change the definition of what an FFL, what a licensee was. We have an American who's no longer with us because of that. Mr. Cummings, response?
He has fended off repeated attacks over past scandals and continues to amass power in Congress, even as his radicalism has at times alienated him from his Freedom Caucus colleagues in the farthest right reaches of the GOP. The committee chair left the pointed attacks on the Biden administration to the first two members of the assembled panel, Senators Chuck Grassley from Iowa and Ron Johnson from Wisconsin. Democrats' control of the Senate has long stymied Republican efforts to investigate President Joe Biden and his son for business dealings abroad, and the fallout over the laptop containing compromising images of Hunter Biden. Grassley described his ongoing efforts to investigate the Biden family as something out of a fiction spy thriller, with senior FBI leadership working to improperly release information about Hillary Clinton's email servers, conceal the connection of the Biden family to foreign powers, and restrict information to stymie his investigations with Johnson.
Growing threats against law enforcement. This morning, an FBI and Department of Homeland Security bulletin warns of increasing threats to
enforcement and some new reporting about a joint memo by the FBI and Homeland Security.
The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are warning of increased threats to government officials and law enforcement.
There was a tidal wave of anger.
Threat bulletin was in fact the specificity of some of the calls to violence they were seeing online.
The FBI has also targeted left-wing protest movements with informants and agitators who have largely avoided charges of entrapment leveled against them. An FBI informant embedded with racial justice protesters in Colorado worked to coerce a protester into committing felonies while on the payroll of the FBI. Democrats on the committee and those testifying on their behalf also largely focused on threats made against the FBI to counter the GOP. They repeatedly referenced the dirty bomb threat made against FBI headquarters last year, alongside other threats and attacks on FBI field offices across the country. Rep. Jamie Raskin from Maryland told the committee that the special subcommittee could become part of a proud history of serious bipartisan oversight stretching from the Teapot Dome investigation to the Boeing investigation, into the Watergate hearings, to the tobacco hearings, to the Select Committee on the January 6 attack. He argued that representation is the right name for the special subcommittee, not because weaponization of the government is its target, but because weaponization of the government is its purpose. That's all for this video, folks. See you next time.